For a brief and brilliant period in the late 1980s and early 90s, Sega dared to imagine something more than your traditional stand-up arcade cabinet. They didn't just want you to play a game, they wanted you to live inside of it. They looked at the arcade floor and saw not just a game room, but an amusement park of imagination. They saw the potential for spectacle, and so they built them. Cockpits that pitched and rolled, motorcycles you could physically lean into, race cars that shuddered with the roar of a V8. These weren't just games, they were destinations. But to understand why these machines were so revolutionary, you have to understand the philosophy that built them. And in this video, I'm going to show you how Sega's unique strategy of immersion completely dominated the arcade scene. And we'll start by looking at the core idea that made every one of these machines an unforgettable event. The philosophy was one of physical presence. The logic was elegant in its ambition. To create a memory that lasted, you had to engage the body. This was a full-scale assault on the senses. But to see this philosophy in its most breathtaking form, we need to climb into the machine that perhaps best encapsulates Sega's audacity. A machine that didn't just simulate flight, it became the ride itself. We're talking about the deluxe sit-down version of Afterburner II. Yeah, the one made famous in the arcade scene in the movie Terminator 2. Standing before it, you weren't just looking at a screen. You were looking at a machine that weighed nearly 1,000 pounds. This wasn't a simple plastic shell. The deluxe cabinet was a substantial, engineering-heavy unit, designated internally by Sega as the TX-1000. It placed you in a mock-up pilot seat surrounded by control panels, within a fully enclosed gondola. Your hands gripped a realistic flight stick and throttle, connected to a complex control unit filled with variable resistors and gears that required precise factory alignment. The immersion began before you even inserted a coin. But the true magic was in the base. The entire gondola was mounted on a sophisticated electromechanical system inside the massive base. This system utilized two separate motor units, one for pitching and one for rolling, each driven by 80-volt DC motors with worm gear speed reducers. When you pulled back on the stick to climb, the pitching motor unit engaged, tilting the entire cockpit structure backwards up to a precise limit, synchronized with the action on screen. Banking into a hard turn engaged the rolling motor, leading the gondola smoothly into the curve. See, this wasn't a wild, acrobatic motion. It was a highly calibrated and responsive experience. And this game sold the combination of blistering superscalar visuals and the precise physical feedback, convincing your body you were pulling G-forces. The roar of the engine and the clatter of the hydraulics were pumped through 15-watt speakers directly into the cockpit, completing the assault on your senses. Afterburner II's deluxe cabinet was a masterclass in creating a complete power fantasy. It proved that a video game could be a serious experience. But what if a tilting cockpit wasn't enough? What if Sega's engineers looked at these motor units and thought, this is a good start, but it's not nearly enough freedom? What if the goal wasn't to just tilt you, but to give you total, unrestricted motion in any direction? The answer to that question wasn't just a new cabinet. It was a technological monstrosity that redefined the limit of what an arcade machine could be. The answer, of course, was the SEGA R-360 and its flagship game, G-LOC Air Battle. If Afterburner's motorized base was impressive, the R-360 was utterly terrifying in its ambition. And its name said it all. Rotate 360. This wasn't a cockpit on a tilting frame. It was a fully enclosed pod, 7 feet in diameter, weighing over a ton, suspended inside a massive metal gyroscopic cage. This cage allowed it to rotate a full 360 degrees, not on one, but on 2 separate axes. Imagine it. The pod could pitch forward and back, yaw left and right, and most astonishingly, roll completely upside down and just keep on spinning. It was, for all intents and purposes, a professional-grade flight simulator gimbal they put in the arcade. Climbing inside was an event. You were secured by a 4-point racing harness and a safety bar. Operators were warned never to leave it unattended, for fear of a player losing a limb. Light sensors would stop the machine if you stuck an arm out, and there were 2 emergency stop buttons. Sega's own warning barred players who were pregnant, had heart conditions, high blood pressure, or mental or psychological issues. Okay. Playing G-LOC in this beast was the purest expression of the term G-force-induced loss of consciousness that's in the title. As you dogfought on the 20-inch monitor inside the pod, the machine would match your every move with violent, precise rotations. A sharp turn didn't just tilt you, it rolled you onto your side, The loop-de-loop would send you completely inverted. It was the ultimate fusion of Sega's ride philosophy and Yu Suzuki's design ethos. A $90,000 monument to over-engineering that only the largest arcades could afford. It was so intense, so immersive, that contemporary reviews literally called it the greatest sensory overload you could get with your clothes on. The R-360 was the final boss of Sega's motion cabinet lineage. But for every machine designed to make you scream with vertigo, Sega also built ones that made you sweat with tension, ones that traded the freedom of the sky for the visceral, shuddering reality of combat much closer to the ground. While Afterburner 2 and the R-360 sold the fantasy of high-altitude jet combat, Thunderblade delivered the gritty, low-altitude chaos of helicopter warfare. Its sit-down cabinet took a different and somewhat low-key approach. You climbed into what looks like a skeleton mock-up of an attack helicopter cockpit, your hands on the control stick that mimicked the real thing. The authenticity immediately grounded you, but Sega knew static realism wasn't enough, so they added motion. The seat and control stick combination was mounted atop a rotating motion base that would swivel horizontally around the X-axis as you steered the controls. This was a different kind of physical feedback. It wasn't electrically powered motion, but a gliding and smooth sense of movement that immediately sold the illusion of your gunship's power. The sound of the engines, the chopper blades, and the weapons fire blasted your eardrum from the speakers that are built into the headrest of the seat. This enveloped you in a 3D audio experience that made it all feel just so real. And this, my friends, is the one you really have to play to understand how well all the pieces come together in a way that creates an utterly real sense of simulation. Now, if Thunderblade brought the battlefield down to Earth, Sega's ambition soon aimed for the stars. The logical and perhaps ultimate progression of their motion cabinet philosophy arrived with Galaxy Force 2. This machine represented a staggering leap in the scale and technological spectacle. It wasn't merely a cockpit, it was a full-sized, self-contained theater of motion, and the true marvel was underneath. The entire contraption, including the seat, controls, and screen, was mounted on a revolutionary hydraulic motion platform with multiple degrees of freedom. This wasn't just tilting or shaking. The Galaxy Force 2 cabinet could precisely simulate the complex physics and movement of 3D spaceflight. The sweeping, banking turns of a starfighter, the sudden lurch of a dive into a canyon on an alien world, the jarring impact of a crash landing. The synchronization between the breathtaking superscalar sprites graphics racing across the huge screen and the corresponding fluid motion of the pedestal created the feeling of seamless movement. You weren't watching a space battle, you were piloting through one, with your body feeling every roll, yaw, and pitch. Galaxy Force 2 was another example of Sega's game ride philosophy, a glorious monument to technical overkill that made every other game in the arcade somehow just seem weak and underpowered. It proved there was no fantasy too grand to physically simulate. Yet, for all of its interstellar ambition, Sega's engineers were also masters of elegant simplicity. They had another idea, one that stripped away the complex machinery and put the player's own body in direct, intuitive control of a simpler, but no less thrilling experience. Sega's pursuit of physicality reached a different kind of extreme with Super Hang-On. Here, the concept of a complex cabinet was entirely abandoned. In its place stood a full-scale replica of a high-performance racing motorcycle. You mounted it, straddling the seat. The genius was in its beautifully simple control scheme. To turn, you physically leaned the entire bike to the left or the right. This created a profound mind-body connection. To take a sharp corner, you committed your whole body weight, just like a real rider. The game responded with a satisfying on-screen lean. The direct mapping was revolutionary. You weren't operating a motorcycle. For that brief moment, you were the rider. It sold the fantasy of speed with a visceral, athletic sensation as you leaned into the curve. Super Hang-On was a pure kinetic thrill. It demonstrated that immersion could be achieved through the most basic of designs. But Sega had one more evolution in mind. What if you took that physical immersion and multiplied it? What if the experience wasn't solitary, but shared? The result would become the defining social spectacle of the 90s arcade. By the early 90s, Sega's philosophy evolved from creating singular rides to crafting social, competitive arenas. What started with arcade classics like Outrun, and then took the first step into the 3D world with Virtua Racing, was then blown away by the apex of this evolution, Daytona USA.
Gentlemen, start your engines.
This incredible NASCAR-inspired racer brought the white-knuckle sense of speed into the third dimension, with its impressive, fully texture-mapped graphics and sense of raw horsepower that was unleashed on Sega's new Model 2 hardware. And the definitive experience playing it was the deluxe sit-down model. I mean, this was a proper cabin. You sank into a bucket seat, surrounded by a full dashboard, a force feedback steering wheel that fought you in the turns. And as the race began, the cabinet began to rumble and move, delivering a symphony of tactile feedback. But Daytona's true masterstroke was linkage. Up to 8 of these massive cabinets could be networked together for head-to-head racing, and this transformed the experience from a solitary time trial into a friendly but sometimes heated social event. The arcade floor became a virtual speedway. The movement of the linked cabins made the competition tangible. You could even feel the vibration of drafting as you pulled alongside a rival. Daytona USA was the culmination of everything Sega had learned. It combined immersive physical feedback with cutting-edge 3D graphics and the electric atmosphere of multiplayer competition. It wasn't just a game you played, it was a new world where you were transported to with your friends. Now, today, we carry photorealistic worlds in our pockets. We have force feedback wheels and flight sticks for our homes, VR headsets that can transport us anywhere. But there's something about the sheer, unapologetic scale of those Sega behemoths that remains unmatched. They were monuments of a specific time and place, the time when the arcade was king, and where to draw a crowd, you had to build a spectacle. These machines were too big, too expensive, and too complex for the living room. Now, unfortunately, as arcades faded, so too did these magnificent machines. But for those of us who were there, who felt our stomachs drop in a barrel roll, who were strapped into a spinning gyroscope, or leaned a full-size bike into a pixelated turn, the memory is as physical as it is visual. These weren't just playing a game, they were taking a ride, and for a handful of quarters, Sega made that fantasy gloriously and unforgettably real. But that's just what I think. What's your take on these Sega masterpieces? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your views. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel. I'd like to invite you to subscribe for more feel-good retro gaming content. Alright my friends, this is the Retro Gaming Boss signing out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. In a prior video, we talked about Sega's titans of the arcade. The machines that shook the floor, Afterburner 2's tilting cockpit, the R-360's spinning terror, that full-body thrill of leaning into a turn and super hang-on. But here's the thing. For every legendary machine that got the Hollywood cameo, the mad geniuses at Sega were building a dozen other experiments. Some were evolutionary dead ends. Others were just too big, too expensive, or too much for most arcades to handle. Today, we're going into the archive. This is Sega's sit-down arcade masterpieces, Part 2, The Forgotten Titans. Now, if you thought the R-360 was the peak of Sega's ambition, buckle up, because you haven't seen the Sega AS1. This thing wasn't a cabinet, it was a self-contained venue, a modular simulation theater that sat 8 players in a fully enclosed pod with a massive screen. They installed these as flagship attractions in Sega worlds. You'd book a time, sit down. It was a curated show, often with custom footage tying into Sega's iconic characters and experiences. And you're probably thinking exactly what I thought. That sounds more like a theme park ride than a game. Spot on. That's the entire point. The AS1 represents a fork in the road. Was the future of arcade games in the graphics alone? Or in creating immersive cinematic spectacles? Sega, being Sega, bet on both. But the AS1's insane cost and size meant it was always a rare beast. Most got scrapped. It was still a breathtaking, wildly impractical vision of arcades as mini amusement parks. A vision that honestly was probably too grand for its time. But here's what's fascinating. It shows Sega wasn't just thinking about the next quarter-eating hit. They were dreaming about what the entire experience could be. But let's rewind. Before the AS1's theater, Sega was perfecting the one-player cockpit, and they knew how to iterate on a great feeling. Take Space Harrier. Its deluxe cabinet was a direct sibling to Thunderblades. You climbed into that familiar frame, as the cab's gentle, responsive sway sold the fantasy of flying through the fantasy zone. It was all about the sync between your body and the screen. And then came Enduro Racer, Hang-On's dirt bike cousin. It looked similar, a full-scale bike without wheels. You leaned to turn, but then you'd approach a jump. And here's the genius part. To get air, you didn't press a button. You physically pulled back on the entire bike, yanking the handlebars toward your chest. That pullback jump, man, it felt intense. A full-body commitment. It created a mind-body connection that Hang-On just didn't quite have. This experience lived and died in the arcade. Pure Sega philosophy. Why simulate it on the screen when you can almost do it for real? Daytona USA showed us the peak of linked racing, but Sega was building social arenas years before. They looked at hits and asked, how do we make this a party? Enter Power Drift. This wasn't realistic racing, it was roller coaster karting on insane winding tracks. The sit-down cab buckled and tilted with every turn. Now, link up to 4 of them, pure, joyful, competitive chaos. It was about sharing that roller coaster feeling, screaming as you all flew off the same ridiculous jump.
You're great!
And then came Outrunners, the spiritual sequel to Outrun, built from the ground up for competition. This was the true bridge between the solo road trip fantasy and the feel of having a packed grandstand cheering on the action. It was Sega refining the recipe. Take great driving games, put in an immersive cockpit, and then multiply the fun. Now we have to talk about the graphics revolution, the 90s, polygons. And Sega didn't just enter that race. They built a monster truck and smashed it through the gate. I'm talking about Virtua Racing DX cabinet. The DX cabinet was an absolute unit. It looked like a Formula 1 chassis. Had a massive panoramic monitor. The force feedback wheel was brutally strong. But the killer feature? Airbags. Seriously, the seat had pneumatic bladders that would inflate and deflate, pushing you against the sides during hard turns, simulating the lurch of braking and acceleration. Combined with a wall of sound, this wasn't just playing the game. This was a full-body data feed. You felt the physics. The DX was a statement. This is the future, and it will shove it into you. That philosophy of feel reached its purest form in Sega Rally Championship. The sit-down cab was more refined, and the genius was in the wheel feedback. Sega Rally was about dirt and gravel. The wheel communicated that texture, the slip, the fight for traction with uncanny precision. It sold the fantasy of controlled chaos, the ultimate translation of a game's feel into a physical sensation. You see, Sega was also brilliantly pragmatic. When you have a masterpiece like the Galaxy Force 2 cabinet, you don't just retire it. You find new games to make it sing. Enter Rad Mobile. This early polygonal racer, with its hanging air freshener and little sonic pendant, had tracks full of sweeping, banked turns. Slap it into a Galaxy Force 2 hydraulic theater, those turns became full-body experiences, proof that a great motion platform could give new life to a game. And we can't forget the late-era kings. Crazy Taxi's deluxe cab, with its gear shift and pounding Offspring soundtrack, turned chaotic fare collecting into a seat-rumbling joyride. And Outrun 2 in its linked SPX deluxe cabinets. The ultimate love letter. It took the classic Outrun feeling, wrapped it in buttery smooth graphics, and let you and a friend chase each other down that endless coast. The final, perfect evolution of a social driving dream that Sega had been chasing for 20 years. Those beautiful Testarossa deluxe cabinets could be linked for head-to-head-to-head racing. I know, today you can play high-fidelity Sims in VR with $1,000 rigs. The tech has caught up, even surpassing what Sega could bolt to an arcade floor. But what remains unique about these forgotten titans, the AS1, Enduro Racer, Virtua Racing DX, is their audacity. They were built for a world where drawing a crowd meant building a spectacle you couldn't get anywhere else. They were expensive, maintenance-heavy, and wildly impractical. And that's exactly why they were magical. But for those of us who were there, the memory isn't just a screenshot. It's the strain you feel in your shoulders when pulling back that dirt bike. It's the surprise of an airbag smashing you into a turn. It's the shared glance with a friend in the next cab over as you lined up on the starting line. Sega wasn't just selling games. They were selling physical stories you'd tell for years. And that's something no home console, no matter how powerful, could ever truly replicate. But that's just my take. What's yours? I want to hear those stories. Drop them in the comments below, and let's get a proper discussion going. If this retro tech spectacle hit the spot, then hitting that like button is the best way to let me know. If you're new here, welcome. We're all about these deep dives into gaming's most fascinating eras. Subscribe so you don't miss my next video. Alright my friends, this is the Retro Gaming Boss signing out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. In the mid-90s, the three biggest names in entertainment, Sega, Universal Studios, and Steven Spielberg's DreamWorks, joined forces to build the future of fun. They poured millions into creating high-tech playgrounds so immersive, so advanced, they made every other arcade look like a relic. It was going to be everywhere. But building the future is expensive. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on the arcade empire that was supposed to take over the world. And more importantly, we're going to take a trip through some of the most groundbreaking games that made these locations feel like magic. I was there at the original GameWorks in Seattle shortly after it opened, and spent way too many days off in front of those cabinets. So keep in mind, what I'm about to share comes mostly from my own direct personal experience. Now before we jump into the games, we have to take a quick look at GameWorks itself. That original location opened in Seattle in March 1997. MTV even threw a live premiere party. Will Smith and Carmen Electra were there. Beck and Coolio performed. I mean, it was insane. Vegas opened a few months later with a 75-foot rock climbing wall. California followed, and even had Tony Hawk doing his aerial tricks at its opening. The plan was for 100 locations by 2002, but each venue cost up to $10 million, and getting prime real estate was a nightmare. And then, DreamWorks pulled out in 2001. The chain peaked at around 30 locations. They filed bankruptcy in 2004. Sega tried to salvage it, but then sold it off. Locations kept closing. And by Christmas Eve 2021, it looked like the lights had finally gone out. But here's the twist. In August of 2022, that downtown Seattle spot, where it all began, reopened its doors. As of today, it's the last one standing. A lone phoenix from the ashes. But why do we even care? It wasn't the GameWorks food or the rock wall. It was the games. So let's talk about the experiences that were actually on those floors. If you walked into a GameWorks in 1997, the first thing that would grab you was the sound and motion of the racing games. They had one called Sega Super GT, which outside of the US was also known as Scud Race. This thing was a visual powerhouse. It ran on Sega's Model 3 hardware, which was so advanced it made home consoles look like toys. You were racing Ferraris and McLaren F1s in the BPR Global GT series. Unlike the aggressive, slide-heavy drifting in Daytona USA, Scud Race introduced a smoother, more gradual drift system. And the cabinet itself was this massive motion-based cradle system that would throw you around with immersive force feedback. It felt like you were actually in a car. But here's what most players didn't realize. That smooth drift system, it actually required more precision than Daytona's power slides. You couldn't just yank the wheel and pray. Oh, and right next to it, you'd probably hear someone yelling. That would be Wave Runner. It was a piece of machinery. Sega took real Yamaha Wave Runner chassis and bolted it onto a 3-axis hydraulic platform running on Model 2 hardware. You had to lean your whole body to steer through tropical ocean courses. You could feel the realistic wave physics fighting you. It was a total body experience that you just couldn't get at home. The tricky part was learning to trust the lead. Fight it too much and you'd wipe out. Go with it, and you'd feel like you were actually skipping across the water. Now, you can't talk about immersive sit-down arcade experiences without mentioning the 1994 Jurassic Park game from Sega. This thing was an absolute monster on the floor. The cabinet was designed to look like the back of a Ford Explorer, the same tour vehicle used from the film. You and a friend would slide into those seats, but that seat wasn't static. It was powered by hydraulic pistons, so when a T-Rex stomped the ground behind you, you actually shook. The game itself was a rail shooter with a joystick, where you'd blast away against velociraptors leaping at the windshield, pteranodons swooping down, and the Tyrannosaurus crashing through fences multiple times. The first time that T-Rex roared and your seat shook beneath you, it felt closer to being in a movie than anything else in the arcade. Remember the skateboarding craze in the late 90s? Sega had it covered with twin sensations. Top Skater and its sequel, Air-Trix, used a physical skateboard controller that you actually stood on. You'd lean to steer, and the board would tilt with your movements. Here's what made them different. Top Skater was about racing to the finish line, but Air-Trix shifted the focus entirely. It was all about technical half-pipe tricks, stringing together combos, and collecting coins to progress. It was like Tony Hawk Pro Skater, but you were physically doing it. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Then you had the games that would make you flinch. Gunblade New York was a high-octane light gun shooter, where you manned a mounted machine gun on a Special Forces helicopter. Your mission was to clear cyborg terrorists out of a fully 3D rendered Manhattan. The guns themselves were massive, heavy-duty swivel mounts that vibrated intensely as you fired. It was chaotic, it was loud, and it made you feel like you were in the middle of an action movie. But here's what most players miss. The vibration wasn't a show. It was tied to the recoil of the virtual gun, which meant holding down the trigger too long would shake your aim off target. You had to fire in controlled bursts. But the king of the horror aisle was the House of the Dead. This was the definitive horror light gun game that single-handedly revived the zombie genre in arcades. What you might not realize is how revolutionary it was. It featured branching paths based on which hostages you managed to save. Your choices actually mattered. And the bosses? They required real strategy to beat. Let me tell you about the magician. He had patterns, tells, moments of vulnerability. You had to learn him like a fighting game opponent.
Kate, this is our only chance. We have to take him while he's weak. We've only got one shot at him.
And for competitive players, Virtua Fighter 3 was the king. Built on Sega's powerful Model 3 hardware, it was just a massive leap forward. The graphics were stunning, and the uneven terrain now affected strategy. Fighting on a slope actually mattered. New characters also joined the roster, but the real game changer was dodging. You could now sway to avoid attacks, adding deep mind games beyond simple blocking. Master the dodge system, and you felt truly untouchable. So that was the mechanic, but here's the problem it created. Once you got good at dodging, you started facing players who would bait you into dodging and then punish your recovery frames. The mind games got deep fast. Released in 1999, F355 Challenge was the ultimate racing simulator. Its deluxe cabinet featured three 29-inch monitors for 170-degree panoramic vision, powered by 4 synchronized Naomi units. With an authentic Momo wheel, a gated shifter, and 3 pedals, it delivered a pure Ferrari experience. There was no forgiveness. Brake too late and you'd spin. I mean, it was brutally difficult, but a clean lap made you feel like a racing god. The tricky part was that gated shifter. You had to be precise or you'd miss the gate entirely and end up grinding into neutral while the field passed you. And last but not least, Psycraft from 2003 felt like the future. You actually hung from an inverted electric motion system, suspended in a futuristic pod. Used for racing games, like Initial D, the cabinet tilted and swung with every turn, leaving you floating through corners. It was rare and expensive, It was disorienting at first, and then became unforgettable. A pure motion experience you wouldn't forget. Check this out. Because you were suspended, the motion was way smoother than any hydraulic system. It felt like flying, not driving. And it ruined every other racing cabinet for me forever. So that's the story of GameWorks and some highlights of its incredible arcade experiences. A monument to late 90s optimism, and now, a sole survivor in the city where it all began. It's a reminder that running a business is tough. But the real legacy isn't about the company structure, it's those incredible game cabinets. It's the feeling of leaning into a turn on Wave Runner, or the shock of a zombie bursting through the door in the House of the Dead. For those of us who were there, it's like a time machine, and for those who weren't, I hope this video gave you a taste of what it was actually like. What's your best memory of going to an arcade like this? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to hear what stuck with you. And if this retro tech spectacle hit the spot, then hitting that like button is the best way to let me know. If you're new here, welcome. We're all about these deep dives into gaming's most fascinating eras. Subscribe so you don't miss my next video. Alright my friends, this is the Retro Gaming Boss signing out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.
Paradise camouflage like a whip cracks enemy silvers.